Hey everyone, Noah Zerby here. This is one of a series of short videos looking at the challenges of global development and inequality. This video focuses in particular on the idea of sustainable development. So let's get to it. Classical models of development took little heed of the environment. Indeed, it was not until the late 1970s that questions of sustainability entered the development lexicon. But today, the idea of sustainable development is commonly espoused. In 2013, the Chinese government was forced to acknowledge the air quality in Beijing was unhealthily bad. It was so bad that it actually hindered visibility. It was so bad that the World Health Organization asserted that breathing in Beijing was the equivalent of smoking about 2.5 packs of cigarettes a day. The American embassy there warned its employees to avoid trips outside. Now, since then, Beijing's air quality has improved fairly dramatically. A 2018 study by the World Health Organization ranked the 500 most polluted cities in the world as measured by particulate matter concentration, and Beijing had ranked number 56th.
Well, welcome to Shijiazhuang, a city a little less than 300 kilometers from Beijing, and one that over the past month has had the rather unenviable honor of being China's most polluted. In fact, by some measures, it is the most polluted city on the planet over that period. Of course, it is just an extreme example of a problem affecting a huge swathe of northern China at the moment, with a pollution cloud hanging over this country from the Russian border in the far northeast all the way down to the central cities of Chongqing and Chengdu, a sweep of a few thousand kilometers or so. Of course, underneath the cloud live hundreds of millions of people, and they are currently struggling with the impact of this toxic air on their lives and livelihoods.
It can be completely dark, as if you're walking in the clouds. The smog impacts my children's health. Coughing is the usual symptom.
I've heard some people say that they are considering leaving Shijiazhuang, moving to the south of China. Have you ever thought of doing the same?
Of course I want to leave, but I cannot afford to. I live here. The whole city and the whole country is polluted. You have to go abroad.
Over the past 30 days, the average air quality level in this city has registered as hazardous on the official scale. Amid mounting public anger across China, the government is pledging to clean up the air and is investing heavily in renewable technology. But there are good reasons for caution and some skepticism. The two main sources for all of this toxic smog are the heavy reliance on coal as the dominant form of power generation and the high and still growing levels of car ownership. And neither of those things look set to change anytime soon.
Now, to be clear, Beijing is hardly alone in this respect, and other cities have experienced massive amounts of air pollution. Cities like Delhi or Mexico City, Lahore, and Ulaanbaatar are all ranked relatively high. And even when we think of a city like Los Angeles as having unhealthy air pollution, it doesn't even register in the top 500 of the world's worst cities. Indeed, nearly all of the 500 worst cities for air pollution in the world are located in developing countries. Why is that? One explanation for this rests with the idea known as the environmental Kuznets curve. Put simply, the environmental Kuznets curve postulates that as a country's economy grows, pollution will increase up to a point, but that at some particular point, continued economic growth actually correlates with a decline in the level of pollution. In other words, the environmental Kuznets curve suggests that as countries develop, pollution increases up to a point. However, once an apex is reached, further development actually correlates with a decrease in pollution and an improving environment. Research actually suggests that the environmental Kuznets curve generally holds, but that different pollutants have different apexes. Particulates, for example, generally begin to decline at about a per capita GDP of about $3,000, while lead levels don't reach their apex until about $18,000. With respect to climate change, which we consider in another video, CO2 emissions appear to have no apex. That is, they continue to increase with the level of development in a linear fashion. This is a real red flag for efforts to use market-based mechanisms to address CO2 emissions and thus climate change. And there's two other things that are of interest here. Research suggests that the shape of the curve is actually flattened by both democracy and trade openness. Why does that matter? The shape of the curve would affect both the point at which we begin to reduce levels of pollution and the maximum level of pollution across all levels of development. In other words, a curve that looks like this would result in significantly more pollution than a curve that looks like this. In other words, trade openness and democracy tend to correlate with lower levels of pollution at all levels of economic development. Democracy, in other words, is good for the environment. Now, conventional wisdom has suggested that poverty facilitates environmental degradation. The poor pollute because they have no other choice. They're concerned with questions of immediate survival, and as a result, they necessarily have a short time frame for analysis. Depleting resources for immediate survival, if necessary, is an obvious choice. It's not that the poor don't care, it's that they lack the capacity to make more sustainable decisions and to maintain a cleaner environment. In his classic text on informal urban settlements, The Planet of Slums, geographer Mike Davis describes a visit to informal settlements outside of Nairobi, Kenya. Here, some 600,000 people live in tin and mud shanties, most barely long enough to lay down in. Residents often sleep on pieces of cardboard on the shanty's dirt floors. An estimated 1/3 of the adult residents of Mutare Valley are HIV positive, and nearly everyone lives on less than $1 per day. Mutare Valley has no police or fire protection and no paved roads. 3 schools serve an estimated 70,000 children. There's no electricity or running water. Public toilets are officially shared, but as a result of structural adjustment programming, a 6-cent charge was imposed for their use. For the average resident of Mutare Valley, this fee represents about 10% of their daily wages. As a result, most can't afford to use the pay toilets and instead rely on what are called flying toilets, relieving themselves in plastic bags and throwing them into the Nairobi River, which also serves as the primary source of water in the valley. But if poverty generates environmental damage at the lowest levels of development, so too does a high level of consumption found in much of the developed world. The concept of ecological footprint has been developed to try to assess how much of the Earth's resources are needed to maintain lives at a particular level of development and consumption. And when we look at the levels of development and consumption around the world, we see some interesting, if troubling, patterns. This chart shows the number of hectares, that is, the amount of land, that would be required to maintain a level of consumption in select countries around the world. Globally, the average level of consumption required is about 2.9 hectares per person, which is almost 20% above the Earth's carrying capacity. The smallest footprint was found in Eritrea at about 1/3 of a hectare. The largest in the United Arab Emirates was almost 16 hectares per person. The United States consumes at a level of about 12 hectares per person, meaning that if everyone lived like the average American, we would need about 5 planet Earths to support the population. Or alternatively, it means that the average American would need to reduce their footprint by about 85% in order to become sustainable. This, of course, raises the question of sustainable development. The most common definition of sustainable development was offered by the Brundtland Commission in 1987. Their report was entitled Our Common Future, and they defined sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Importantly, that idea of sustainable development has 2 central elements. The first addresses the needs of the current world's poor, that is the development part. And the second considers limits imposed by technology, social organization, and the environment on the future. This is the sustainable part. Normally, when we think of sustainable development, we think of its 3 common core features: social, environmental, and economic. And we need to have all 3 to have sustainable development. If we have only social and environmental sustainability, we're really talking about a situation of sustainable or bearable poverty. And if we have social and economic sustainability, we're really talking about equitable growth without concern for long-term environmental sustainability. If we have economic and environmental sustainability, we arrive at a system in which the poor are necessarily excluded, raising questions about the political viability of the project. It's only when we combine economic, social, and environmental sustainability that we can really talk about sustainable development. Here's another way to think about that same question. The United Nations Human Development Report annually classifies countries according to broad measures of economic and social development. According to this measure, countries which score above a 0.8 are considered highly developed. At the same time, the idea of the ecological footprint measures the environmental impact of each country's consumption. Note that because of resource depletion, the world biocapacity has actually declined over time and now stands at about 1.79. Any country that's consuming above that level is consuming at a level that's beyond the Earth's carrying capacity. Noting the ecological sustainability line that we have here, we can divide countries into 4 quadrants. In the first are those countries which are ecologically sustainable, but which have not yet achieved a high level of economic or social development. We might classify these countries as existing in a situation of sustainable poverty. In the second group are those countries which are both ecologically and socially unsustainable. Ironically, we might call this a situation of environmentally unsustainable poverty. The third group are comprised of those countries that are economically and socially developed, but which use an unsustainable amount of the Earth's resources to reach this level. Countries in this quadrant are essentially living above theirs and the Earth's carrying capacity. And finally, in the fourth quadrant are those countries that are both ecologically sustainable and maintain a high level of human development. Unfortunately, you can see that this quadrant is actually empty. From this perspective, sustainable development is about how to move countries from the other 3 quadrants to this one. But this also implies several different challenges. For countries suffering from sustainable poverty, the question is how to improve living standards without dramatically increasing the country's ecological footprint. Conversely, for countries in the unsustainably developed quadrant, the question is how to reduce the ecological impact of their consumption without undermining their level of development. And finally, for countries in the unsustainable poverty category, the challenge is how to achieve both simultaneously. So that concludes our brief overview of the idea of sustainable development. Please share your thoughts in the comment section below, and thanks for watching. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.